Okay, I have 2 past the hour, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our WAYF Disambiguation Working Group webinar. I'm Heather Staines. I do the publisher outreach for SeamlessAccess. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. You probably have noticed that we are recording. So if you do not want to be on camera or have your voice recorded, please turn off your camera, and a recording of this event will be shared with attendees and registrants shortly after the conclusion. So you can feel free to share that with colleagues. I will ask anyone who's not actively speaking, including our presenters, to go ahead and mute their microphones to keep the background noise down. We do have the chat open today for you to participate in. We're going to hold questions until the end, till all the presenters have gone, and we have a nice time set aside for discussion. And you will be able to unmute and turn your cameras on so that we can have a lively conversation at that point. And with that, I will hand you over to your host for today, Hilke Kurz.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Heather. So let me kick it off with, again, welcome you all. Thank you very much for joining. Good evening, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. And I'd like to kick it off with saying a few words about SeamlessAccess for those of you that are less familiar with the initiative, and then hand it over to the other speakers to really talk about the work of the working group. So SeamlessAccess is really at its core all about improving the access experience for researchers to online content and online services where they need to authenticate, doing that in a way that works both on campus and off campus, and really building on top of the existing technology of federated access, federated authentication, making that easier to work. Federated authentication is a very powerful technology, but it can also be very complex. So the value that SeamlessAccess adds on top of that is to really make it easier for researchers to work with. Ideally enabling a state of truly single sign-on, and also working together with folks in identity federations to further that infrastructure and further the standards development that are happening in that space. So important to realize what SeamlessAccess is also not. SeamlessAccess is not a federation in and of itself. We work closely together with federations and consume metadata. I hear a bit of an echo, so let me ask if people who are not speaking, if they can mute themselves, please. SeamlessAccess is also not an authentication service. SeamlessAccess helps to get the reader, to get the user, the end user, the researchers to the right IDP. But SeamlessAccess in itself does not have anything to do, or does not sit in the middle of the authentication process that happens from that point onwards. And of course, very important to recognize, SeamlessAccess is not by any way collecting data. The only information that SeamlessAccess knows about is the user's choice of IDP, and that is stored in their own local browser, where the user at any moment in time can choose to discard that if they wish. So having spoken a bit about what SeamlessAccess is not, let me talk about what SeamlessAccess is. And the way I think about it, it's really 3 distinct value elements. There's an access button, the IDP discovery service, and a persistence layer or persistence service. The access button really offers researchers a standard visual cue such that they know on different websites, different places where they go to do their research, that they can use this mechanism to get access via that mechanism of federated authentication. And I think the real key value here is about that standardization, so that users start to recognize it and they start to build trust in following this route. The button is context aware, so if SeamlessAccess is aware of the user affiliation, if that is stored in a persistence layer, that can be displayed, and otherwise it's not. And it can be integrated into the access flow at the service provider in a variety of ways. The second main value element of SeamlessAccess is the IDP discovery service, the where are you from process. Much more on that in the second bit of the webinar, the main body of the webinar. This is a standardized method to find your institution from a long list. We've done quite a lot of user research on this, so we like to think that this is a best practice, best in class implementation of the IDP discovery journey. And also, again, here we think that offering a similar experience to researchers on a variety of places and resources where they go to will really help them in the long run, because they start to recognize it and they understand what to do. and really making that more simple and more seamless. The third main element is the persistent service, and this is where SeamlessAccess stores the user's choice of IDP in their local browser, and that can be exposed to integrators. So it's accessible by SeamlessAccess, of course, but also our approved integrators. It's implemented in a way that respects users' privacy, and the user can choose to opt out at any moment in time. But as long as the persistent service is populated with the user's latest choice of IDP, that will make the whole authentication journey easier, because they do not need to find their IDP from a potentially very long list again. We're very happy and glad to see that adoption is growing quite steadily. At this point in time, we have 19 known SeamlessAccess integrations, and we say known because for the limited or standard integrations, in fact, people can use SeamlessAccess even without alerting us. We ask that they do, but we have no way of tracking that consistently if people do not inform us. That is different for the advanced integration pattern. And just a shout out to two of our recent joiners, De Guiter and IEEE Explorer, who have recently joined SeamlessAccess. And here you see how they have implemented the button with the consistent iconography and a call to action, but also doing justice to their own UI designs. We're also happy to see that the usage continues to grow. So good increment in the service utilization between 2020 and today, 2022, really solid growth, and we think that this is trending and will remain for the foreseeable future. I spoke a lot about SeamlessAccess as a service, but SeamlessAccess is also much more than a service. It's also a community of people that comes together to solve issues that are sometimes very difficult or challenging, or make it more difficult to adopt that underlying framework of federated authentication. We typically do that in the form of working groups. The example on the right, the contract language working group, they've also recently developed some recommendations that we'll present shortly. But the main topic of today, the outcome of the working group on how to improve the federated WAYF services, or the notoriously challenging problem of WAYF entry disambiguation. And I think that is a very good moment for me to hand it over, closing the general introduction to SeamlessAccess and really moving into the main topic of the webinar for today. So Heather, I think up to you to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you. I think our next speaker, Heather Flanagan of SeamlessAccess and Spherical Cow Consulting, really needs no introduction. Most of you know her well from the space. So take it away, Heather.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad to see you all here today. So this is a topic that generally gets people a bit anxious because it sounds very technical. And if you're a librarian that's just trying to support the users, and this may seem a little bit intimidating, it shouldn't be. I'm going to start by just making sure that we're on the same page for a couple of the terms that you're going to hear used repeatedly throughout this webinar. The first one is, let's be very clear, what is a where are you from service? So that's the point where when a user goes to the site, they're being offered the opportunity to log in using their campus identity or their organizational identity. Well, first they have to find their organization in a list. How that list is presented varies significantly, but that's the point of the WAYF service, the where are you from service, getting the user to their IDP so that they can then finish the next steps in the flow to authenticate. Next slide, please. There are a couple of different common terms used here when we talk about the different components of a WAYF service. There's the display name, and that's the name that the user sees for the IDP. It's supposed to be a fairly user-friendly name, something that they would recognize, and it's registered with the identity federation that's actually holding everybody's metadata so everybody knows who to talk to with everybody else. Well, presenting a user-friendly name is obviously extremely important, but you also actually have to have an identifier for the system itself. This usually looks like a URL. Technically it isn't, but that doesn't matter. That's the entity ID. And the entity ID identifies the identity provider, from the system's perspective. It is also included in the metadata. everything tends to be included in the metadata, and that's actually an important point. So those two terms, display name, entity ID, think of it as something the user sees and something that computers use to talk to each other. Next slide, please. So in a world where there's one single federation and only that federation's data, this is not as significant a problem as it has grown to be. What we're talking about with WAYF disambiguation and whatnot is there are times where when the user sees their list, it's not obvious what institution is actually theirs. Now, the WAYF disambiguation working group went through and identified 5 different scenarios where this happens, and it happens today. These aren't theoretical. These are things that actually happen. The first one is where you come to that user-friendly name, but if you are aggregating data from multiple federations, so say your service provider has aggregated the data from the In-Common Federation and the Open Athens Federation and maybe the UK Federation, suddenly you've got some what look like duplicate entries. They're not. They may very well have different entity IDs, but what the user sees are very similar display names. And yet if you click the wrong one from the perspective of the service provider and what relationships they have, then the flow isn't going to work the way everybody expects. The users may be able to log in, but that identity provider may not actually have the relationship with the service provider or the publisher in this case to authorize access to the material. This can happen within the same federation as well. And I'm going to we'll go through and actually show examples for all of these things so that you don't have to try and remember all of this on one page. But suffice to say, even within one federation, this can happen, though it's usually not quite as common as when you aggregate data. Sometimes it's not the display name that's is the same, but the actual entity ID is the same and registered in multiple federations. So the users may see something repeated and not understand why or which one to use. You may have similar display names, but the institutions themselves are completely unrelated. They're not there. And there are cases where in some countries, they consolidate effort and they say, all right, there's a single IDP and everybody gets to use it. And when the user searches for their institution, this other IDP will just show up and they may not know why. We'll show you how that looks. Next slide, please. Okay, so what happens when you have similar display names, but the metadata from multiple federations has been aggregated? This is what SeamlessAccess does. SeamlessAccess aggregates the data from several federations. And so this is a problem that is absolutely prevalent in the SeamlessAccess service. It occurs when, the users are presented these choices, but you're going to see things repeated. And it matters that, well, in this case, Boston College, they have a campus IDP that's registered with the In-Common Federation. They have a library IDP registered with Open Athens. The user doesn't know In-Common. The user doesn't know Open Athens. The user knows that, yes, I go to school here or I work here, but that's all. So what do you do in this case? There are lots of different options, and that's where we get to the recommendations that we're going to talk about later. Next slide, please. Okay, you can have similar display names in the same federation. This often occurs when you've actually got 2 campuses or excuse me, 2 departments that have both registered IDPs, or you've got a test IDP as well as a production IDP, and maybe the university name is particularly long. And so the fact that they've added test falls off the end. So the user might only see University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, at which point it scrolls off the side of the screen and they never see test or something like that. So again, this is not uncommon thing to see. Next slide, please. But wait, there's more. Okay, now we're going to move past the display name, the name that the user sees, and talk about, well, what happens when the entity ID is the same thing, but has been registered in multiple federations. This one is tricky because that entity ID may actually have a different target depending on what federation they're in. And a thing to remember is that a service provider or publisher doesn't have control over when there's multiple things in a list, which thing is displayed first. It's going to vary if something else gets added to their system, the order may change. So this is a very hard problem to actually end up controlling. But it is something that we have seen in other instances. Next slide, please. Okay. What happens when you have similar display names, but the institutions, in fact, are not related at all? People have to remember to read the fine print. And in my experience, people don't really enjoy reading fine print, much less anything else. Boston College is another, it has been an example of this because there's a Boston College in the United States. There's also a Boston College in the UK. They are not related institutions, but as you see on the list, there are several Boston colleges. Wait, there's also Boston University. I would hope that a student would remember that there is a difference between a university and a college, but who knows how it's going to work for them. So a shared IDP. This is something that's not uncommon at all with certain federations around the world, where there's a single identity provider for all of their customers. And so depending on what the user types, they may see some things they don't expect. This isn't exactly a collision of name in the same way that some of the other examples are. This is much more the user might not expect what they see because of how the architecture has been set up in the background. So the Norwegian Federation is called federated. And if you search on Oslo, you're not going to get anything that says Oslo. You're going to get federated. If you type in Bergen, then you're going to get something from them and something from federated. So it's confusing for the user. What are they supposed to do in these cases? All of that is why we had this working group to say, you know what, we have to provide better guidance here, because as the world moves toward federated access, and the world is absolutely moving towards federated access, we're going to see more of these types of collisions. And the first step is making people aware that this could even be a problem when they're trying to set things up. I hope that helps set the stage for why we think this is a problem, why the working group came together, and why we offer the recommendations that we do. With that, I shall hand it over to the next.
Thank you very much, Heather. And I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, John Feltz, who's going to present the boots on the ground library perspective. John has been very active talking about seamless access. I was fortunate to meet him in person at the NASIG meeting, and he'll be in Charleston next week on a session. John is currently head of information technology and collections at Coastal Carolina University. He's worked in academic library technology for more than 30 years and is a former patent holder and co-founder of Journal Finder, the first open URL resolver and knowledge base to go into production in the United States. Throughout his career, John is focused on identifying and implementing innovative uses of technology in the provision of library services, online user privacy protection, and improving the user experience for accessing online resources. He, as I mentioned, is an active member of the Coalition for Seamless Access. So welcome, John. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you for that very kind introduction that I wrote for you. And so essentially, and next slide, please, Helga. Essentially, the problem that more than one institutional display name in a vendor's WAYF discovery service creates for libraries and library users is that it confuses the user and makes the research journey for them needlessly complicated. At Coastal Carolina University, which is my home institution, we typically see two display names for Coastal Carolina, one from the Open Athens Federation, which is through whom the library is registered, and then one from InCommon, which is registered by the campus writ large. Currently, unfortunately, both of these functionally provide access to a given resource, but each pathway has a very different authentication experience. Therefore, there's a 50-50 chance that the user selects the display name that directs them through our local shibboleth, which is the metadata used by InCommon and is used by many other departments on campus, as opposed to Open Athens, which is used exclusively by the library and has been branded with CCU imagery and provides a very consistent look and feel that is recognizable to our users. This inconsistent login experience between InCommons and Open Athens is confusing to our users who sometimes think that they don't have access to a resource that they are rightfully entitled to. Also consider that if the service provider has implemented seamless access, that whichever selection made by the user is stored in their browser local storage, which then establishes persistence to the wrong access point, and that in turn follows the user until they manually change their affiliation or whenever it is released by the browser. So this also has a negative impact on our usage data as well, which for the non-librarians out there, we heavily rely on that information to make informed subscription decisions because every user access journey that uses InCommon isn't captured and counted in our Open Athens analytics platform. We miss that information. In turn, if cost per use becomes and remains high, it's very possible that a library could consider unsubscribing to a resource that was actually being used by their user community. We don't want that, of course. Perhaps the best way to show you the negative impact this has on library users is to just walk you through the user journey from the open web to, in this case, one of the information resources that Coastal Carolina subscribes to. So stay on this slide, Hilke. So the most frequent scenario that my library encounters is when the user begins their research on Google Scholar, but this could occur from anywhere on the open web. And in this case, searching on the topic nanoplastics. So the first search result is clicked on, which takes the researcher to the ScienceDirect platform. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the user then clicks on the intuitive seamless access access through your institution button, which starts the authentication process. Next slide, please. I'm going to bounce through them here now. So as you can see, the nature of the problem, which Hilke touched on and Heather Flanagan expounded upon, is that we, upon entering our institution into the ScienceDirect's WAYF discovery service, we see the problem that there are two display names for Coastal Carolina University. So let's take a look at the user experience when they select each one of these. The first display name is via Open Athens, which is the preferred and appropriate access point for our library users. And you can see that it is branded with CCU logo, which is very consistent branding and imagery that we use across all vendor platforms and helps the user recognize that this is the appropriate affiliation. Next slide. And this, of course, as part of the authentication process, sends the user to Coastal Carolina's two-factor authentication, which is very familiar to them since it is used for campus email and other heavily used platforms on campus. So, you know, users know when they see that they are in the right place. Next slide, please. And then we'll go to the second display name. When that was selected, you can see that it's a different look because this uses the metadata that we have registered within InCommon for the university writ large. And next slide. And then this bounces the user through our local shibboleth. And, you know, many departments on campus authenticate into various shared research platforms. And so our campus IT has InCommon configured to use this local shibboleth software, which is unfamiliar to our users. And since this isn't used only by the library, we have very little input into the metadata that InCommon uses. And this creates the different user experience between Open Athens and in Commons. This is very unique. Most of our general users, unless they're a heavy duty researcher or a faculty member, they won't even see, they'll never see the shibboleth interface. So they won't know what this means or what even to do with it. Again, we're fortunate in that if they did plunk in their username and their password, it does functionally work. So they will end up where they're supposed to. But again, this is confusing. So that in a nutshell is the user journey and the problems that occur when we have two display names presented to the user. Again, it's unnecessary and it's needlessly confusing to them. So.
Thank you so much, John. I think that really adds a lot to the conversation. With that, I will hand over to the last section of our presentation today before we go into discussion. We'll be hearing from Adam Snook. Adam is an experienced technical consultant at Open Athens, and he specializes in technical implementation and onboarding new customers there. He uses his knowledge and experience to train and support internal staff, partner technical teams, as well as customers. And as part of the sales and onboarding process, he works with customer IT and library teams to gather their requirements, problem solve any technical issues, and create tailored solutions. Adam's knowledge and expertise extends to contributions to industry working groups, as he'll tell us about today, to help solve common challenges around federated, single sign-on, and improve the user experience. Adam was an active member in the SeamlessAccess working group on the challenges around WAYF, which is why we've tapped him to join us here today. And he often represents Open Athens at local and international events to promote the benefits of federated single sign-on to the wider community. Thank you so much for joining us and agreeing to present today.
Thank you. And I forgot how non-brief my brief was. Thank you for your patience with that, Heather.
I even cut some of it out, actually. But
yeah, apologies for that. I'll make it briefer next time. So yeah, we got together, and over the course of various months with lots of participants, we came up with the following recommendations. As you've seen from both Heather's pre-piece and John's real-world example, display name is a vital part of making this a little bit better for end users. So an action for anybody who's running an IDP or looking to acquire another IDP within an institution is to check and see if your organization already has an IDP. For example, do we have a campus run SHIB being run for various things? How can we make these either interact together or perhaps replace one with another, whatever? If you are settled on, nope, we need two different IDPs, make sure that the second IDP, the one that's coming later, the new one, has a distinct display name. So in John's example, could be put library in the background, or change the in common entity display name, just so that people have an indication on exactly what I'm going to be sent to. The other secondary point here is make sure display name fits on a mobile device. If you've got a really long organization name, as Heather inferred, it will cut off the end. So maybe think of a prefix. Who knows? It's up to you ultimately as an organization what display name you have, but just make sure that they're distinct. Also, actions for federations are give members the ability to change their display name. And side note for people like Open Athens, do more due diligence when registering additional IDPs. Do those checks to help the members make an informed decision. A slide, please. So there are MDUI extensions, so metadata user interface extensions. And one of the key ones is a description. Is that the next one? Oh, sorry, this is the display name one. Yeah, so within the no, this is the description. Apologies. So within the metadata, you effectively register two pieces of information. There's the display name, which we previously talked about, which is the organization name typically, or the department, the whatever it might be. And then there's a description, which is separate. And that can be used to provide additional information. So maybe it is for a particular department. This is the identity provider specifically for such and such. So when registering identity providers with federations or other services, do add helpful descriptions within the metadata to further indicate to the user what this IDP's primary purpose is, or what it's intended for. Federations, make sure that you're building support that people can supply descriptions in the MDUI extension, so that then it's populated within the metadata, because ultimately 9 times out of 10, if a vendor has a WAYF, they're more likely getting all of the information that is displayed directly from the metadata. Some vendors will build their own and populate it with information from their own database, but 9 times out of 10 is coming directly from the metadata. So make sure you publish it in the metadata. In addition, from the IDP discovery service perspective, so SeamlessAccess, Wayfinder, vendor developed WAYF pages or organization discovery pages, build support for descriptions, make them available. Again, we don't necessarily have any recommendations on exactly how to do that. There are options. Maybe it appears beneath, maybe it's a hover. But again, with any recommendation around UIs, always think about accessibility, I would say. So it doesn't have to be, it doesn't necessarily have to be a visually perfect thing approved from marketing necessarily. It needs to be accessible as well. Next slide, please. Keywords. So in a way, similar to description, is adding additional information in the metadata that will help better tailor the search or provide additional information to narrow down the organization that I'm trying to log in as. So again, in John's example there, where we've got kind of campus run and library run services, perhaps library would be a good keyword for the other identity provider, so that you could just put in organization library in the search and hopefully get the correct result. Again, people that have multiple campuses, or what are they called? Specialities. So different speciality campuses, physics, law school, that kind of thing. Just enrich the metadata with additional information. Again, action for the Federation. Build support, ensure you allow for these keywords within the metadata. Likewise, from an IDP discovery service perspective, utilize these things from the metadata so that you can build better tailored searches within the system. And refeds are developing a registry of common keywords, because sometimes it's given a blank sheet of paper, right? Write down some labels, categories, keywords to describe your identity. Well, you could come up with all kinds of different things, some of which may or may not be relevant. So building a common set of keywords will, I think, help other people label their own IDPs. Next slide, please. Logos. So taking Heather's example of Boston College, whereby there's a Boston College in the US and there's a Boston College in the UK. If there was a logo within there, that would help better identify, aha, this is my org versus this is not my org. So adding logos within the metadata is very useful to make sure that it is representative of your organization. Because again, people are quite visual. Heather sort of joked that, yeah, people don't really read the fine print. But if there's an image that clearly shows, I don't know, my mascot for my organization or whatever it is, it just signposts it much better. Where it could potentially get more difficult in the example where actually the same organization has two different identity providers, the logo there not necessarily going to be as helpful because it could be the same, but maybe you've got departmental or campus logos. Just think carefully about how you can quickly and easily signpost things to people. Again, action for the Federation, build support for it. So uploading logos within the metadata, and IDP discovery services build support to display these logos. Now, where it gets difficult is around support for what file type. So SVG here is an example. Maybe you've only got PNGs. Make them transparent so that they appear on kind of any background. There's kind of recommendations there, but in terms of sizes, that is something that you could spin up a whole nother working group just talking about logos. I think they've already existed. That's quite difficult because different services have different requirements. So perhaps expanding on that is action for federations and indeed IDP discovery services. Publish your requirements for logos. What kind of restrictions in terms of size, what do you call them? Aspect ratios, that kind of stuff. And then advertise it, populate it, build support for it. Slide. So those generally were recommendations on improving the WAYF part, the IDP discovery part, how to make that much easier for end users. But there are, if people that certainly operate in a library or provide A to Z list, discovery services and like content discovery, link resolvers, stuff like that, then you will also probably want to build support for WAYFless linking. Slide, please. So if you've got a library web page, let's say, or a discovery service, and you're simply linking to sciencedirect.com, picking on Science Direct, well, now you've got to navigate through the institutional login. You're forcing the user to have to go through the organizational search. Whereas if you provide a WAYFless link to Science Direct, then the user clicks that link, will be taken to your login page, whether it's SHIB, OpenAthens, SimpleSAML PHP, Okta, doesn't really matter. Whatever your IDP service is, it will take them straight there and then to sciencedirect.com or the journal article database. So building in WAYFless support for any link out link that you're populating will effectively negate the need to go through a WAYF at all. So that's the main pro for it. The con, yeah, it's limited. So that isn't going to affect the open web user, someone just going to Google, Yahoo, whatever search engine they're using. But if you are providing links and people have gone to your site, it will promote that. That is a pro, seamless linking. Again, not all SPs support them. Some support WAYFless linking, but not necessarily deep linking. What I mean by that is you can have an authenticated link that takes you straight to your SHIB IDP, but won't take you to a journal or article or database. That's what I refer to as deep linking, so linking to a specific page. So whilst this varies, if an SP, if a vendor supports it, my general recommendation is use them. And yeah, similar to the first bullet point, that last one, it's only useful if going from the library portal, the discovery service, the whatever, not the open web. But there we go. That's me. Now I think I'll hand back to Hilke.
Excellent.
Heather looks like she would like to add something.
I do.
Yeah,
I have a
comment
little
in
bit
the
of
low.
color to add.
Go for it.
So all of these recommendations that the group came up with, I would describe each of them as necessary but not sufficient. No one thing there will solve everybody's problems. Logos are brilliant, but as I noted in the chat, one of the biggest challenges we've had with logos, and trust me, we've been talking about logos in the Federation space for a very, very long time, is that the part of a campus that actually mandates what the campus logo is going to be and all is generally a department that is completely separate and away from anything that IT is doing. There's no relationship there to leverage. So if the Federation comes in and says, we require everybody to have standardized logos, getting the campus to do that is very, very hard. It would be a great idea, but it's very hard. Also, logos give you a sense of how difficult this can be. I was chair of a working group that was supposed to come up with logo recommendations, and my co-chair is blind. He was probably the most neutral person in the world to participate in this because he had never seen a logo. It did not help him in the slightest. So would they be very helpful for many? Absolutely. Is it the answer? No. The other point is that these are all, as you see, we had specific actions for the different entities that are somehow involved in making a WAYF service better. The campus itself, the service provider, the federation operator, the consortia that actually helps set best practices for federations. At this point, those have now been presented as out there, but SeamlessAccess is in no position to tell anybody what to do. We are offering our best guess, our best guidance. Whether that's picked up kind of depends on you and how much you are willing to say, yes, this makes sense and we want to see this going forward. Your energy is what will help turn these recommendations into things that people actually try and do. So that was my color commentary to all of it.
Great. Thank you very much, Heather. And let me thank the speakers once more. Thank you, John. Thank you, Adam. We're now entering the Q&A and the discussion part. I already see some discussion happening in the chat, so that is great to see. Please carry on. And there were two questions posed, if I have been monitoring this well. The first question from Candace. Candace, would you mind unmuting and maybe voice your question, if that's all right?
Yes, good morning from Southern California. We at the Claremont Colleges are unique in that while we're not exactly a consortia, we behave like one. There are 5 undergraduate, 2 graduate institutions. We will be soon going with having just one IDP. We're implementing a new identity and access management system on the campuses. So we have found we've had good success thus far for our users in that when they're presented with a list of institution names, the Pomona College student can find Pomona College. The library staff members can find just the entry that says the Claremont Colleges. But I'm just curious, I want to make sure that when we have just one IDP, which is this new identity and access management system, that we can still have that user experience where there are each of the 5 undergraduate, the 2 graduate institutions have their names listed individually, but they would all point to the same one IDP.
Thank you very much for that question. I think the use case is clear. I see Heather putting her hand up. Heather, you want to go first at addressing that? Thank you.
That would be really challenging because suddenly what you're saying is the entity ID would be the same and then just lots of different display names, possibly different entries in the system because they may have different logos and things like that. There are some federations that actually have policies against that. So I don't know if that would work. What I would consider in your case, if you haven't already considered it, is to make each of your institution names, plural, as your keywords. Have your main display name be whatever the overarching campus would be, but then people would still be able to search on the details and have this pop up. So part of this would be outreach then to your users so they know what to expect. And part of it would be the technology to make sure that when someone is searching on one of any of those other names that something comes up for them to choose. Harvard has a very similar challenge because Harvard is probably one of the most schizophrenic universities that I know of. There's so many different schools under that umbrella that may or may not share. I think they finally share identity information, but for a while they didn't. And getting people to the right thing was very hard. So you're not alone in this challenge, that's for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Heather. Adam, John, anything that you would wish to add to that?
Again, with the use of MDUI extensions, it's to work together. It is potential to effectively add multiple display names, but that again, varying levels of support in terms of the many different organization discovery services out there. So some might show the other organization names, some might not, which comes down to communication, dissemination, getting more people to build support for all these things.
All right, thank you. Let me move on to the next question, if that's all right. And that is Michiel from Surf. Michiel, do you want to maybe voice your question yourself, if that's all right?
Yeah, that's all right, Hilke. Thanks. I'm representing SURF, the Dutch National Identity Federation for Education and Research. And I was wondering if there are tests available within probably SeamlessAccess, which highlight for us the suspect cases of well, I would say duplications, but the WAYF challenges you mentioned in the seminar. That would be helpful if we want to fix them for or help our institutions fix them.
At this point, there's no good way to test for that. It's actually a very, very challenging problem to discover in an automated fashion. Because just exactly how the display name, there may be like an extra space or something like that. So we were very challenged to just do a search and say, okay, here are obvious duplicates. So turning that into a service, there's no good code for that. We had one example, which was, we didn't show it, it might have been useful, where it was absolutely, a duplicate display name. It's just that one name was in English and the other one was in Swedish. So the users who, presumably all spoke English very well, for them, duplicate, which one did they go to? Finding that via code wasn't going to happen.
I suspect that a perfect solution will not be there, but yeah, I think some of them, same entity ID, multiple federations, would be very easy to spot.
Well,
yeah,
Surf is part of Edugain. I mean, you have access to all of the metadata, just about. And I think the metadata that SeamlessAccess uses, which includes Open Athens, which Edugain does not, is something that you would be able to get your hands on if you or your team had the time and interest to try and put something like that together. That would be brilliant, and we could possibly post that code to the SeamlessAccess site.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for posting this question.
That's what you get for making a suggestion or a recommendation, Michiel. Yes, please is the answer.
This is a great idea.
Great idea. We welcome the pull
recognize.
requests. Okay, yes, thank you.
I recognize the challenge, Heather, and this is not going to be easy. But I really liked the idea and the suggestion of the, if there's something we can do to detect this with automated tests. So we'll bounce that around a bit more also in the SeamlessAccess group.
So just to add my 2 pence. So as you mentioned, checking entity IDs, that's easy. One thing I typically use, like every day, I'm always in the Refed's Metadata Explorer tool. So in terms of tools, that's one I use regularly. And I simply search for the domain. So for example, Boston College. The US version is coming here. So I will put bc.edu in the Metadata Explorer tool. Bosh, it comes up. Now I know, okay, don't use that entity ID. So that's good. But what it doesn't show is, but there's also another org with that display name. And you can't really search display names anywhere. So what we've done is we've wrote a bunch of scripts that basically it uses the Edugain feed to look at all the display names everywhere, to look at duplicates. But yeah, it's much more difficult to do, what's it called? Semantic searches. I'm sure there probably are tools that do that kind of stuff. But I certainly wouldn't know the first thing about doing that for looking for similar names.
I can imagine that it is very difficult, but well, we as InSurf can only solve the problems for our institutions and what we deliver in our upstream feed. So it would be very helpful if there is some kind of tests automatically and they can be red, yellow, and green. For red is real problem, yellow it's maybe a problem, we don't know. And then well, we can search for it and possibly solve. But agree, it's very difficult.
I'm gonna press pause on the specifics of this, but thanks for the suggestion. Definitely food for thought. I see, Paul, you have your hand up.
Yeah.
Do you want to weigh in on this, or are you reporting back that in the meantime you guys have solved the problem for consistent logos for organizations in the chat?
So I will weigh in on Heather's comment about the Swedish and the English name of an organization. That is based on this organization I know really well because we had a long discussion with them. It's about IT department don't speak to the library and the other way around. So the library has bought OpenFMs to do stuff. That was a Swedish name, and the IT department has published things in SAMID, that is our federation, in English and Swedish. But so there you have the problem. It's not within the academic federations. You normally have the problems between, say, between different worlds. Right now we have two worlds, the Identity Federation, Academic Federation, and Open Access. It could be more in the future.
Thank you for that, Paul. Chris, I think you wanted to respond to that. I see your hand.
Yeah, no, different point. Just wanted to thank everybody for the presentations. I thought they were really good at illustrating the problem. One suggestion, it would be really good, and maybe you already have this and you didn't have time to include it, but it would be good to see the recommendations applied to the problem examples that you showed, right? So if the best practices were implemented for those cases, what would it look like? And obviously you can't implement them because that relies on the organizations, but maybe make it a little bit clearer to understand how the recommendations would help.
That's a really good point, Chris. Similar to like when I said Heather said no one reads a small print, and an illustration says more than the words. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I like that as a suggestion as well. We'll not play the same trick and ask you, Chris, to work that through, but we'll take that as a recommendation for our next step. We have about 5 minutes left. I have one question that I would like to ask to the presenters, but before I do that, let me look around the table to see if there's people in the audience that still have a question or a comment or any feedback. All right, if not, my question to the three speakers is, so you presented this wide array of, I think, very powerful actionable recommendations for different stakeholders groups pertaining to logos, keywords, metadata, and so on and so forth. Is there a specific sequencing that we're thinking about? Are there recommendations that necessarily build on top of each other? Or do you have examples of a recommendation that you think will have the biggest impact? Where do we focus on? And is there sort of a logical ordering here? Maybe John, may I ask you to reflect on that, if that's all right?
I'd be more than happy to, but I have no idea the answer to that question. So I would, coming from a library perspective, my total perspective is a little bit limited on more into the user side of things. So I would gladly hand off to Heather or Adam or whomever on that.
Okay, thank you. Adam, Heather,
So when we put the recommendations together, they actually are in order. They're in order of what the most people could do today, right? With what's available, what they have control of. The lowest hanging fruit is think hard about your display name. That's right there. That's like the most impactful thing organizations could do. Look at how your name is displayed and think about how to differentiate that for your users. What's a little bit harder? It's a little bit harder to get sorted out on logos because, again, that's a whole different campus department that's usually responsible for that, and getting the right permission to have a logo that works in this kind of environment. Those are campus conversations that are a little bit more weighty, a little bit more complicated. Moving on to keywords and whatnot. Right now, hardly anybody uses keywords. It's not a common, there is provision for it in the technical specifications, but they're not used very much. So that's a little bit more complicated. So that's how the recommendations were laid out in terms of short-term, medium-term, long-term changes.
Excellent, thank you. And I noticed
my very quick point,
yeah, Adam,
just jump into that, is already been mentioned, but communication. Basically, the more people talk, so the typical, I don't want to say divide, but the thing we hear all the time is IT library, those two silos. Well, don't be siloed, have a conversation, talk together, try and do something. If you're going, one of you, whether it is using that example, IT or library, looking to procure another system, have a three-way conversation. Even if you're not gonna build an IDP together, at least try and procure another one together so that you're on the same page about display names. What are these two specific IDPs? What are their functions? How can we make it clear to the IDPs, to the end users, the patrons? Communication.
Absolutely. This is being presented as a problem as people are using technology, but it's not exclusively a technology problem. The technology itself can only do so much to sort out the communication challenges that are happening on each and every campus, sometimes between departments like library and IT, sometimes in educating users so that they know what to do and what to expect.
That sounds like an excellent closing remark, because we are exactly at the hour and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Let me thank all the speakers once more. John, Heather, Adam, thank you very much. Thank you, Heather Staines, for kicking it off. And thanks everybody in the audience for joining us, of course. I put the link to the report with the recommendations in the chat. So if you have a moment, please take a look there and take a look at the recommendations in order there. Thank you all very much. And echoing what Adam says, please communicate, speak about this. The more people are aware of this, the easier it's going to make progress in solving it. Thank you all very much.